Good evening, Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
So glad to see everybody this evening and those who are live streaming as well. Well, as Rabbi Cohn intimated at the beginning of the service, Israel is on all of our minds these days, what is going on there and how we can think about it. And as Rabbi Cohn also went on to say, we pray for the peace of Jerusalem and for peace in that region in all of its many manifestations. And I want to talk about Israel as well tonight. I hope that all of you have a handout sheet front and back. If you don't have one, maybe you can look on with somebody. What I want to do first is read something that I read this morning in the New York Times, which I have gently expanded and edited, but I wanted to lay the foundation for what we're going to be discussing. It is quite obvious that Israel is going through a real trauma at this point. The far-right government wants to limit judicial independence, to allow Parliament to override Supreme Court decisions, to restrict the court's ability to block laws passed by Parliament, and to give the government control over the committee that appoints new judges. In response, much of the Israeli public is up in arms, including elements of the military, in ways that are unprecedented. Massive protests, including acts of civil disobedience, have taken place in cities across Israel for weeks in response to widespread public anger about the government's proposal to reduce the influence of the judiciary. The issue has severely divided Israeli society, leading to fears for the future of the country's democracy and prompting warnings of political violence and even civil war. Now, when a country has begun to lose its way, one of the responses available to it is to look back to its sources, to the foundations of its collective life, to be able to recover its balance, to relocate its first principles. And so what I want to do is look to this handout with the title, Turning to Foundational Texts in moments of crisis. And I've chosen three of them. First, an event that takes place in the Bible, which I'm going to introduce in a moment. Secondly, Lincoln's great Gettysburg Address and an excerpt of it. And then on the back page, a passage from Israel's Declaration of Independence. I've also brought a poem by Yehuda Amichai, one of Israel's great poets, who creates a vision of the future, which I find stunning and emotional. And that's one of the things we look to our poets for, to dig down beneath reason's structure to our emotions and our emotional reaction to things. So what I'm going to do now is come out and read this with you. Those of you who are live streaming do not have this handout, but if you want one, you can call my assistant, Cindy Wilson, early in the week. She gets back here on Tuesday, and she'll have a sheet that she can then forward to you. The first passage of returning to foundational documents is found at the end of the book of 2 Kings, at the end of what scholars call the primary history of ancient Israel, the first 11 books, the 5 books of Moses and the 6 histories, Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, the end of which is the destruction of Jerusalem and the exile of the people to Babylonia. Here we have an episode in the life and reign of King Josiah, clearly the greatest of all kings of ancient Judah and Israel, and he is depicted in language that reminds us, certainly the author's purpose, of Moses. And what has happened here is Josiah has sent to the officials at the temple in order to release funds to pay the workers who are clearing out and reconstructing elements of the temple. And when they do so, something remarkable happens. So let me begin to read here. Then the high priest Hilkiah said to the scribe Shaphan, I have found a scroll of the teaching in the house of the Lord. Interesting in its own right. Evidently, this scroll, which scholars believe has some significant connection to the Torah. It may not be the Torah per se, but certainly a kind of proto-Torah, which has been lost. And so it looks like the Torah was not available to the people of that day. And now they have found this scroll. The date is 621 before the Common Era, in the 19th year of the reign of King Josiah. And Hilkiah gave the scroll to Shaphan, who read it. The scribe Shaphan then went to the king and reported to the king, your servants have melted down the silver that was deposited in the house, and they have delivered it to the overseers of the work who are in charge at the house of the Lord. The scribe Shaphan told the king, the high priest Hilkiah has given me a scroll. And Shaphan read it to the king. He's going to rejoice, we imagine, a found scroll. When the king heard the words of the scroll of the teaching, he rent his clothes. And the king gave orders to the priest Hilkiah and to Ahikam, the son of Shaphan, Achbor, the son of Micaiah, the scribe Shaphan, and Asaiah, the king's minister, go inquire of the Lord on my behalf and on behalf of the people and on behalf of all Judah concerning the word of this scroll that has been found. For great indeed must be the wrath of the Lord that has been kindled against us, because our ancestors did not obey the words of this scroll to do all that has been prescribed for us, having lost touch with the foundations of the society. So the priest Hilkiah, and this is a surprise in itself, and Ahikam, Achbor, Shaphan, and Asaiah went to the prophetess Huldah. Now, as I imagine it, Huldah lives down the street from Jeremiah. But they don't go to Jeremiah. They go to the prophetess Huldah, one of the 4 prophets mentioned in the Bible. The wife of Shallum, son of Tikva, the son of Harchas, the keeper of the wardrobe, who was living in Jerusalem in the Mishnah, an area in Jerusalem. And they spoke to her, and she responded, thus said the Lord, the God of Israel, say to the man who sent you to me, thus said the Lord, I'm going to bring disaster upon this place and to its inhabitants in accordance with all the words of the scroll which the king of Judah has read. Because they have forsaken me and have made offerings to other gods and vexed me with all of their deeds. My wrath is kindled against this place, and it shall not be quenched. At the king's summons, all the elders of Judah and Jerusalem assembled before him. The king went up to the house of the Lord together with all the men of Judah and all the inhabitants of Jerusalem, and the priests and prophets, all the people young and old, and he read to them the entire text of the covenant scroll, which had been found in the house of the Lord. The king stood by the pillar and solemnized the covenant before the Lord, that they would follow the Lord and observe his commandments, his injunctions, and his laws with all their heart and soul, the language out of Deuteronomy, that they would fulfill all the terms of this covenant as prescribed in the scroll. And all the people entered into the covenant. Crisis, a return to a foundational document, reconstituting the people on the basis of what they discovered. Let's look at the next document, And that is just an excerpt from Lincoln's great Gettysburg Address. 272 words, 3.5 minutes to deliver. The main address of that day was by Dr. Edward Everett, who spoke, president of Harvard, a former senator, representative, spoke for 2 hours. He sat down, Lincoln got up. People hadn't adjusted their hats before Lincoln was done. To his great credit, Everett wrote to Lincoln the next day and said to him, "If I could have accomplished in 2 hours what you accomplished in 3 minutes, I would have been deeply gratified." A gesture of largesse by Edward Everett. America was adrift at this point. The Fugitive Slave Law in 1850 declared that African Americans were not citizens. In 1854, we have the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which led to what we call Bleeding Kansas. And after the Battle of Gettysburg on July 1st, 1863, that's not right. That's the beginning of the Battle of Gettysburg. November 19th, I think it is. And here's what Lincoln says. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. A reference to the language of the Declaration of Independence. A return to a foundational document. And what does that document say, which Lincoln is now reminding the people about? It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus so far nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us. He's referring to the great task articulated in the Declaration of Independence, a reference back to a foundational document. That from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead have not died in vain. That this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom. And that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Exactly what happened at the time of King Josiah. Crisis, referral back to a foundational document to regain the balance in the society, and resolve to rebuild the country on the basis of what they discovered. On the back page, excerpts from the Declaration of Independence, promulgated on May 14th, 1948. We declare that with effect from the very moment of the termination of the mandate being tonight, the eve of the Sabbath, the 6th of ER in 57008, until the establishment of elected regular authorities of the state in accordance with the Constitution, which will be adopted by the elected Constituent Assembly not later than October 1st, 1948, which never happened. The People's Council shall act as a provisional council of state, and its executive organ, the People's Administration, shall be the provisional government of the Jewish state to be called Israel. The state of Israel will be open for Jewish immigration and for the ingathering of exiles. It will foster the development of the country for the benefit of all its inhabitants. It will be based on freedom, justice, and peace, as envisaged by the prophets of Israel, another of our famed foundational documents. It will ensure complete equality of social and political rights to all its inhabitants, irrespective of religion, race, or sex. It will guarantee freedom of religion, conscience, language, education, and culture. It will safeguard the holy places of all religions, and it will be faithful to the principles of the Charter of the United Nations. A return to the foundations of the State of Israel, which, if taken seriously, would significantly ameliorate the situation in which Israel and in the region finds itself. A third example, by my reckoning, of the need in crisis to return to the basics. And now I just want to read this marvelous poem by Yehuda Amichai, who proposes a vision of the future. As many of you know, several of us have been involved in weekly poetry session. And one of the things we have discovered over the many sessions is that the greatest poets shock us, often by a first line and often by last lines. And I want to suggest to you, as I think you may see, it's the last lines of this poem which are transformative. Tourists. Visits of condolence is all we get from them. They squat at the Holocaust Memorial. They put on grave faces at the Wailing Wall, and they laugh behind the heavy curtains in their hotels. They have their pictures taken together with our famous dead at Rachel's tomb and Herzl's tomb, and on the top of Ammunition Hill. They weep over our sweet boys and lust over our tough girls, and hang up their underwear to dry quickly in cool blue bathrooms. Once I sat on the steps by a gate at David's Tower. I placed my 2 heavy baskets at my side. A group of tourists was standing around their guide, and I became their target marker. You see that man with the baskets? Just right of his head, there's an arch from the Roman period, just right of his head. But he's moving. I said to myself, redemption will come only if their guide tells them, you see that arch from the Roman period? It's not important. But next to it, left down and a bit, there sits a man who bought fruit and vegetables for his family. A nation at peace, a nation where people live their lives providing for their families. Doesn't say who, it implies the many. And where those who come to Jerusalem are not more interested in artifacts than they are the well-being of the people on the ground. So we have another minute or two, and I wonder if you have some comments or questions about what I've proposed here this evening. I have a feeling that there are those there who already know some of these things, maybe all of them. Well, you agree with this idea or not, that a return to foundations at times of crisis is what is fundamental to the well-being of people? And of course, we can't return to foundational documents unless we know them, or at least are familiar with their depth, their prestige, their quality, their importance. Part of the function of education, not to remember everything we've learned, but to know where to go to get something. And again, those of you who are live streaming, feel free to call in for a copy of these documents. Shabbat Shalom.